You're listening to Session 20 of the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Hey everybody, it's Matt here. It's Session 20 already. How did we get here so fast? Anyway, thanks for joining me today. Today's a long-awaited question and answer show with Greg Hanley. You guys have been so patient. We've tried to schedule this once or twice, and we managed to get it done over the holiday break. So, Greg's been kind enough to appear for the third time on the podcast. His first two appearances have been the most downloaded of all the podcasts to date. We take quite a bit of time going through all these questions, so I'm going to try to keep this introduction short. But I do real quick want to thank all of you who took time to fill out the survey that I sent out. And that survey was a listener feedback survey designed at giving me information so I can improve the listener experience. I can't get into all the results here. I might do that in a future episode, but in brief, I want to let you know I read through every single response, and I got quite a few suggestions on how to improve the show. And I look forward to taking action on these things as we transition into 2017 here. Getting back to this episode, I find myself really enjoying the listener Q&A format. Going forward, I'm going to try to work in some listener questions or two into my regular interviews, so you can stay tuned for that. The way I'll probably do this is that the next time I conduct an interview, I'll send a note out to mailing list subscribers and let you know the guest and the topic. Then I'll choose a question or two from what I get back. So if you want to get on that list, you can head on over to behavioralobservations.com and click on the bright red button to your right and follow the prompts from there. It's pretty simple. So again, I want to keep this introduction really brief because we do have a lot of material to get through. So without any further ado, please enjoy this listener Q&A episode with Dr. Greg Hanley. Hey, Greg Hanley, welcome back to the Behavioral Observations Podcast. How are you doing?
I'm great, Matt. Thanks for having me back. Happy to be here.
Well, I really appreciate you coming back for round number 3. So this is I've had some repeat guests, but this is the first three-peat, if you will. So thanks for indulging the crowd once again. I want to let you know that, I know we were chatting prior to hitting the record button here that, there's an intense interest in what you have to say and the topics that you like to talk about, so episodes 1 and 7 that you appeared on have been the most downloaded shows out of the 19 or so podcasts that I've published to date. So it just speaks, I think, to the message of what you have to say and people's intense interest in trying to help kiddos and adults with problem behavior. So I think episode number 1's been downloaded almost 10,000 times, which is just completely mind-blowing.
Yeah, that's really neat. I mean, it's an important topic, right? Most of us BCBAs are called upon to help folks with problem behavior. So I just happen to be talking about something that has value to who we are as a field. I tell you, I've been enjoying your podcast. I really like what you're doing, and it's just great to see the field communicating in multiple different ways, and we need that. So it's great. And you're reaching practitioners. When I go to conferences and I meet up with people and they know the kind of things that we are working on right now, I say, how'd you learn about that? And they say, well, I listened to the Behavioral Observations podcast. I say, all right, another good one, another point from Matt. So, yeah, it's good stuff what you're doing. So thanks for doing it. Keep doing it.
Thanks. I appreciate it. It's a really fun project. Do people ask you, or do people ask you if you want a whiskey smash?
They do. Thank goodness.
Okay. Yeah. So at the very least, there's that, right?
Yes. That's right.
Well, I've got a list of questions here. But is there anything? So what's crazy is that we re-recorded the second episode more than a year ago. Excuse me. I know I didn't release it. I released it more recently than that. But so I wanted to see before we get into the questions here. Is there anything new that you want to update us on in terms of the ISCA process and what sort of research you're doing and things like that?
Sure. We have a fair amount of projects going on. Basically, we are really trying to move it out and figure out ways to get the treatments to work in relevant settings. We're asking questions about maintenance, generality, parent training, the preventative efficacy of a program like this, as well as gearing up to do some kind of randomized control trial to really see in somewhat of an actuarial sense whether, what's the probability this process will improve outcomes in meaningful ways for the kids it's designed for, and really get a hit rate. I think we're looking at those sort of questions. They're intriguing us right now. We also have a really neat home-based prevention program called Balance that we're working on, but it's in its infant stage, and but I'm excited about that. And then there's a question that someone had here that we'll probably get to, but we're also applying some of our skill-based treatments better to automatically reinforce behavior, especially stereotypy, and that's really exciting too.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So we got some good stuff going on. We're just trying to move forward.
And another question, kind of before we get into the listener questions, is I can't let this opportunity pass without asking about the symposium at ABAI last spring in Chicago. For those who weren't there, there was kind of or at least I'm going to editorialize here for a second, but there was kind of an epic showdown between you and Wayne Fisher, who is a mentor of yours,
certainly,
and it was like watching a teenager or a young adult argue with a parent, and I had that like an Irish Thanksgiving or something like that. Like despite my last name,
that's a good way. That's a good way to frame it.
That's right. That's right.
I think
I'm
Wayne,
half Irish,
I
folks,
don't
so
know.
don't please, don't write in.
I don't know if I don't know how it came across necessarily. I do know that I was thankful that Wayne started out and modeled some kind of cordiality, and I hope I followed suit. I have a lot of respect for Wayne. Obviously, I mentioned that several times at that event, and we just happen to disagree on some details. But to me, the devil's in the details, and they're important details. But nevertheless, I give Wayne a lot of credit, because a lot of people have commented in ways that they don't understand or don't appreciate the way we're doing analyses nowadays. But Wayne was generous enough to talk about it publicly. Wayne was generous enough to do a comparative analysis, spend some of his research time on it, and engage the conversation. So, I've always respected Wayne since the day he hired me, and I continue to this day because of the way he handles himself professionally in such a transparent way. But it was fun. I think we left with a little more common ground than we started with. I think that was a good thing, and I think we probably dispelled some of concerns that people may have had about why Wayne proceeds one way, why my research and practice group proceeds a different way. And what's neat is the conversation's still going. It's going on in the journals, although that's a slow and grinding process. And so we'll see what shakes out. But it was a nice opportunity, and I really wish there were more events like that at ABBA, to be honest, where we just, in a transparent sense, talk about the things that are not published pages.
Yeah. It was unlike any event I've seen. And I've been doing this for a little bit, and it was it's funny. It was in Chicago, and if it was at the Hilton down the street, you could have done it in the room where the Lincoln Douglas debates took place. Where ABBA was held. I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, I think. It was really anyway. I'm not going to belabor the point, but it was.
Well, we don't see disagreement aired out much, in a public sense, and that's unfortunate. I would say we see it more in basic research. When there was debates on matching and molar versus molecular interpretations, different predictive models, there was much more public disagreement. That was fun. Even if you weren't really into the content, you went just because it's interesting to see that kind of dialogue, as people were attracted to that. I think people were looking for more of a train wreck and more of Wayne and I to attack each other, but there was none of that. There was just the content and the disagreement.
Well,
And,
there was some passion there though. So
there was definitely some passion there. We were running out of time. We were pressed for time, and so that added another factor to an already potentially contentious event. Just being pressed for time made it that much more intense, if you will.
Yeah, I saw some colleagues who right after that who were attending a different event. I was like, you guys just missed something awesome. So anyway, it was fun. But again, I don't want to belabor that point, but I wanted to highlight that because it was cool, and hope to see some more dialogue like that at future conferences. And I agree with you. I think that's healthy. So, but having said all that, I've got some listeners who've been really champing at the bit to ask some questions about the ISCA process. So if it's all right with you, let's go through and check out what people are asking about.
Great, let's get into it.
All right, cool. So I'm gonna just kind of bang through this list here, and I'm gonna kind of be mindful of your time here. I know you're probably about an hour and a half south of where I am right now, but we've got about a storm that's going to bring about 20 inches of snow on us.
You go. This is true.
Coming at
you more than me, but we're both going to get whacked.
We're going to get whacked here, yeah. So we'll be mindful of time. We may not be able to get them all in, but we'll just kind of go through and see what we can get to. So, all right. Without any further ado, Greg Elsky asks, how do you run the early phases of tolerance training when the reinforcer is not immediately available or not available at all? For example, I want Disneyland.
Sure. Yes, this is a great question that Greg asked. What I try to teach our group to focus on is to set up your original analysis conditions to evoke MANs that can be reinforced in somewhat of an analog setting. Okay, so we're not running our analyses under natural conditions. We're usually running them in a controlled space, and we do that partly so that we can get a lot of repeatability of set the EO, get a response, respond, and so on and so forth. So again, some kids are going to make requests that are completely unreasonable in the sense we can't reinforce them in the moment. We try to deal with that in the early stages, well before we get to tolerance training, to teach kids the game. These are the things that you can man for that we're going to provide and then eventually withhold. So we deal with that at that front end. We also have this phrase where when someone asks for something that's not deliverable at the moment, we say, I'm sorry, that's not reasonable. And we move on. It's basically a signaled extinction.
Yes.
Okay. And so we try to get some kind of control over the type of MANs that will be emitted, and then we can begin our tolerance training so we can make it clear that we are going to reinforce them intermittently and unpredictably, which that thing they manned for. So again, the trick is really in the analysis phase to give that child opportunities to man for things that are available. So we want to populate that environment with many things that are going to evoke manding that can be reinforced at the moment. And that, again, goes back to synthesized contingencies, right? Not putting a toy in the room, putting many toys in the room that people have used to control problem behavior. And then, again, using signaled extinction as needed. Those unreasonable or unreinforceable MANs get tagged with that's not reasonable and no reinforcement. This, unfortunately, that sometimes leads to a little resurgence in problem behavior, and we simply deal with that through extinction. But it's extinction in the context of differential reinforcement. Those reasonable MANs then become stronger in probability, and then we're off to the races.
Right, and I would imagine if, people in the natural environment aren't consequating problem behavior with Disneyland with all that much frequency. So I would imagine some of those, there might be some, from an analysis standpoint, there's more than likely something else that's reinforcing that repertoire of challenging behaviors. Is that fair to say?
I think that's a good question. We don't know. Sometimes it's just part of the response class of manding, and the MANs get a little more unreasonable as a larger chunk of MANs are reinforced consistently. So it could simply be that is the reinforcer. It is a MAN. They are specifying the event that's important to them at the moment. It could also be that unreasonable MAN is maintained by a different reinforcement contingency, just like you're saying. And there's no doubt that just controlling the conversation and getting access to somebody's attention is a reinforcer. And so those unreasonable MANs can certainly be influenced by that. Although we've never shown that, I believe that to be the case, certainly.
Yeah, it could make people jump through hoops and things like that. That's kind of where
Of
I was
course.
thinking. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think you're right on. I think that's something that needs to be demonstrated. We have control by preferred conversations and things like that, but I don't think we've shown. I don't think anyone's shown that these unreasonable demands are maintained by some other reinforcer than that which the man specifies, and undoubtedly that is happening.
Hmm.
With kids, there's a lot of kids with autism that have mans that are completely out of stimulus and evocative control.
Yep.
They're just messy manders, I call them, and those messy mans are usually maintained by things that are not specified, and usually simpler than the thing that is specified. But again, that's an empirical thing that needs to be demonstrated empirically.
Sure.
This is something you and I probably see in practice, but the research is yet to catch up.
Okay, cool. Laura Peterhoff asks, she's got like a 5-part question here. We'll just take them one by one.
Yeah.
I tell you, people are totally into this. So she asks, what do you tell parents or school staff? What do you tell parents or school staff to do if the client starts to say "my way" outside of the session? Do you tell them to reinforce it every time, if reasonable? You can tell she's listening because she used the word reasonable there.
There you go. That's a term I like to use too with families and teachers. We do say if the child, if the mans that we're teaching in sessions bleeds outside a session, which is in the long run a good thing, right? That kind of generality. We do say try to reinforce it as much as you can if we're in those early stages of FCT. If we're in a later stage where we've already begun tolerance training, we'll try to export that kind of schedule where you sometimes reinforce demand and you sometimes expect more behavior. So we basically have changed our tune a little bit in how we transport the treatment out. And this question kind of allows me to talk about that a little bit. We used to really focus on shaping up the entire repertoire, okay? Communication, toleration, compliance. And until that repertoire was completely shaped, we didn't export the treatment to other settings, and we really didn't want relevant people from relevant contexts implementing the treatment. But like Laura brings up, sometimes those skills come out. And so that's one reason why we changed our transfer model. The other reason is we noticed that sometimes when we waited for all skills to be acquired, and then we put mom and dad in the room, we saw return to baseline levels despite the contingencies supporting the right behaviors. And so because of those two reasons, we have a different transfer model now, and it goes something like this. At every stage of treatment, let's say with FCT's one stage, once they have the communication response, we now like to bring the parents or the teachers or at least someone else in the room to implement the treatment, and we start the generality process earlier. Okay, so then once they learn the tolerance response from an expert, the expert develops the tolerance response, then we put the parents back in the room. So we're now introducing parents to the treatment sequentially as opposed to at the very end of the process. Once we introduce them sequentially, we still say, listen, don't take this on the road. Just do what you've been doing to manage at home. If the communication or toleration response happens, though, we do say, just like Laura insinuated, we say reinforce it to the best you can. Awesome. We worry about chaining problem behavior and all that with these nice skills, but it's inevitable. And so I think the best way to get through this, and I'll end on this, the best way to deal with this is to do the treatment as fast as possible. Okay. That's the last thing we're trying to focus on. My group spends too much time developing these skills. We have models where parents come in but 2 hours a week. It's just not good enough. We really need to see kids 4 or 5 hours a week. We need to be in schools implementing this 2 hours, 3 hours a day so we can get through the skill building process fast so we can get it out into the natural environment quicker. And then we can avoid all these issues more readily.
Okay. So you already kind of went ahead and answered her second question about transfer, which is an excellent question.
Oh, yeah. There you go.
Would you even consider this process for a behavior in which the reinforcer is one you cannot deliver or allow? For example, pica, or I'm sure we could also put self-injury in there or anything else in that kind of harmful realm.
We certainly do this. This question kind of has two bits to it. Okay, so the question seems to suggest, would you do this with automatically reinforced behavior? So I'd like to touch upon that. Then the other one is, would you do this with severe topographies of problem behavior? So I'd like to talk about that because they're really independent factors to consider. Let's take the second one first. We do the ISCA with severe problem behavior, no matter how severe the behavior is. In fact, the early understanding was this might be a good procedure for kids with like kind of easy to manage, low intensity problem behaviors. I don't know where that came from, but that is not the case. In fact, the first 3 kids in the studies did not have easy behavior. It was quite severe, quite harmful. They were breaking bones and hurting people and on their way to residential programming. We do this with severe problem behavior, and we think the reason why it's important to do with severe problem behavior is the ISK is fast and it's relatively safe because we stop behavior quickly with the synthesized reinforcer. So yes, we apply this with severe problem behavior, including self-injury. Now, when it comes to things like pica, readily admit I have not applied the ISKA to pica.
Okay.
I was fortunately involved with the early pica studies with functional analyses with Kathleen Piazza. They involved baiting the environment with safe to consume items. It's certainly, you should probably be doing this with medical oversight. I had the luxury when we did these analyses with Kathleen of having medical availability of personnel during the analyses. I think that's one of the reasons I don't do that, because I do not have medical personnel in my outpatient clinic. But nevertheless, could you do the ISKA with pica? The answer is yes. Let's give the caveats. One, you got to bait the environment with things that are safe for the child to consume. You might consider allowing the behavior to occur, and then upon that first instance, reinforcing it and ending the session before they consume the item. That might be consistent with a trial latency-based analysis. I think that would be a smart application of it. Again, just because you do a latency, a trial-based, doesn't mean you need to use the standard procedures. You can still synthesize and inform the contingency, but just once the behavior occurs one time, provide the reinforcer and move on. I think that would be a smart thing to do with pica. Again, I think having some medical personnel there would be in people's best interest, but I see no reason why it could not be done with pica. The assumption that pica is often maintained by automatic reinforcement probably isn't true. If you look at any review, the social sensitivity has been shown with pica repeatedly. So yes, I think you can do this. I haven't, but those are the things I would consider were I to do it.
Okay, so let's look at stereotypic behavior then.
Yeah, great. A lot of times people have the question, well, what about automatic reinforcement? Anytime I do a workshop, they're just politely waiting for me to talk about automatic reinforcement and how the ISKA addresses that. So let me take that on its own. We'll get to stereotypy. When we do an interview, it becomes somewhat evident that the behavior seems to be controlled by automatic or sensory reinforcers during that conversation. If that's the case, we simply run in a lone condition. And if behavior persists in the absence of any change in the environment, we use that as a baseline to treat. Now, it doesn't mean problem behavior is insensitive to other reinforcers. And sometimes we will run an ISKA with a synthesized social reinforcer to see if we see more behavior than we do in an alone condition. In other words, to see if it's sensitive to those social reinforcers. If it is, we'll treat the behavior with the treatment predicated on control by social reinforcement. But that which remains, that which is left over, that persists in the without any change, that's what we would consider the automatically reinforced behavior, and we would treat accordingly. So what would that analysis look like? It's one condition called the alone or ignore condition. And so there is nothing special about a standard analysis for detecting control by automatic reinforcement. It's simply a default when we show it persists without change, and so we do that in a single condition. Is that an ISKA? I guess so. It's informed by an interview, and I'm not running 4 or 5 conditions. I'm merely running the one. There's precedent for that well before we started doing what we do. So that's the first thing, what we do in the analysis. But secondarily, Dr. Jessica Slayton has just started a project. Well, it's been going on for about 1.5 years now, where we're applying our skill-based treatment to automatically reinforce stereotypy. Now, understand, this is not automatically reinforced self-injury. This is automatically reinforced behavior that we can tolerate occurring sometime. And the treatment effects are really pretty strong, and we're very happy with it, and I'm pretty excited to share it soon. But basically, it looks like this. We teach the kids engaging in chronic stereotypy that's interfering with learning or social interaction. We teach them to ask for permission to engage in stereotypy. And we're working with kids that don't have any sometimes vocal verbal behavior. but they learn to say things like, may I play now? May I do it now? Okay, and they sometimes have interesting words that their parents have taught them to label their stereotypy, and they demand for it. And what do we do at first? Well, we say yes every single time. And if they don't demand for it, we block stereotypy.
Do you block them as a prior to prompting the man so that they're not having free access to?
That's right. That's exactly right. So it looks like this: they're engaging in stereotypy. We put our hands on their hands to quiet their hands or quiet their body, depending on the form of their stereotypy, and we prompt, say, "May I play?" They say it, and we back off, and we let them engage in stereotypy. 30 seconds later, we go back in, we restrict access to stereotypy, prompt demand, move off. Within usually sessions, these are 5-minute sessions, the child learns to emit some rudimentary demand, and then we shape it up into something stronger. And then we go right into tolerance training, and then we go right into compliance training. And what Jessica's shown is we've got kids who haven't done discrete trials for a long time. Their IEP goals aren't being met. But when we apply this intermittent, unpredictable reinforcement of communication, toleration, compliance, these kids are learning their skills. So when they're sitting down at the table, they're working. They demand for stereotypy. We sometimes say yes. We sometimes say no. They say, okay, no problem. We sometimes reinforce that. We sometimes don't. And then sometimes we say, in a field of 6, match this, point to this, and we get their discrete trials going without any stereotypy. It's going really well. What
That's
we're
exciting.
also seeing, it's very exciting. It's a project that is most interesting to me that we have going on right now, because we're in the thick of it and the data are coming in and they're looking sharp. The other thing that was neat is we got a couple kids. We're targeting motor stereotypy. They have vocal stereotypy. It's obviously easier to target the motor stereotypy with blocking and differential reinforcement. And we're seeing concomitant effects on the vocal stereotypy. So although we're not treating vocal stereotypy, we're not, because we can't block it.
Right. I was going to ask about that.
Response interruption, right? And we can talk about that, but we just let it be. We just don't have any programmatic contingencies in place, but we're seeing it co-vary. In other words, it's happening when the motor stereotypy is allowed to happening. It's not happening when we've made it clear motor stereotypy shouldn't, these other behaviors should happen. So that's pretty exciting. I don't know if that'll hold up. I have a feeling we're going to meet some clients when we'll get nice influence on motor, and the vocals will need something else. We're extending the treatment now, where instead of blocking, we're using Dr. Ahern's RERD treatment, response interruption redirection. So instead of blocking, we have the child do 3 vocal compliances if they will, or we'll do 3 motor compliances so we can guide them. And I don't know how that'll work out. We're just starting those projects right now. But it's exciting. It's basically the same treatment, and I like things that are consistent and fairly straightforward, and that's what this is. No matter what the controlling contingency is, we're using the same skill-based treatment, and that leaves off one section of the population that we serve, and that is kids who have self-injurious behavior that is fairly injurious, and it's automatically reinforced. And when I do workshops, I make it very clear that I can offer nothing special for these children. That which I do with these children has been in the literature for 10, 15, 20, 30 years. What we've been doing is what I would do too. I have nothing new to offer in that department. I think what we're fairly effective with right now is when problem behavior is maintained by social reinforcement, and or problem behavior is non-injurious and maintained by automatic reinforcement. But it's that last quadrant, if you will, of automatically reinforced self-injury that we're basically enriching the environment, trying to teach them play skills, and using some sort of punishment contingency to decrease that behavior, or using protective equipment and trying to fade out that equipment. That's what we've been doing I was taught to do in the early 90s, mid 90s, that is, and that's what I'm continuing to do with the kids that present in that way.
Yeah, I worked a lot with that population many years ago, and yeah, it's just a really, really tough profile to program for. So
it is.
I get it. All right, so let's see. Laura's last question here. When the interview and FA show that problem behavior occurs when demands are not complied with, i.e., someone's being told no, Do you still teach the simple and complex FCT? I think she means FCR.
Yeah.
If so, what would this look like? Would the student demand the teacher say no, the student say my way, please, and the teacher would then either deliver or say no again? Or would you skip the simple and complex FCT and go directly to the delay and denial tolerance training program?
Good. Yeah, that's a really great question. I want to make clear that little interaction that Laura described is exactly the kind of interaction we're trying to program. It sounds a little bit laborious, this conversation going back and forth, but I try to have that happen for kids who are not interacting verbally, i.e. socially, with other adults. Okay, so to me, that dialogue that just happened, I would try to program something like that for kids who are not engaging in that dialogue. By contrast, I meet some kids that, with or without autism, they're like mini lawyers. They're constantly engaging in the dialogue, and that's exactly what the parents and teachers do not want. And so, again, whether we're programming that interaction or not really depends on the baseline and what the parents' goals are regarding language and continued interaction. But more to the point of the question, if the child's mands are incredibly precise, it's fairly obvious that which they're manding for, there is a controlling, establishing operation, and when the mand is reinforced, it satisfies the child, then I sometimes you go right to tolerance training.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and I think that's fine. If there's precision to the mand, and we can turn problem behavior off by reinforcing those mands each and every time, then I don't think it's a problem going right to tolerance training. However, many of the kids with problem behavior that we see, their mands are somewhat imprecise. And their mands have also been chained probably with problem behavior. So it's really a mess. And when it's a mess like that, I like to go back and clean up the language game a little bit by teaching them a generalized mand to get all their reinforcers, to turn off all the O's to make sure problem behavior will not occur. And I will rebuild that repertoire, and I'll get back to specific mands. We have a neat project going on that teaches us how to do that. So to me, it's all in the precision of the mand.
And that's why you'd use a novel mand too, right? With no baggage associated with it.
That's exactly right. And you there's another question on here, if you don't mind me just
go right ahead.
skipping to it, by Chad Favre. He was asking, because during a previous podcast, I referred to a study that kind of conferred the advantages of that novel mand, Matt, just like you mentioned. And we need more research in this area, but I really like what this study contributes. It's by Mark Derby, Wayne Fisher, Kathleen Piazza, Art Wilkie, and I believe Catherine Johnson. It was published in Behavior Modification in 1998. And basically, it's a really elegant analysis showing that when you reinforce existing mands and you put problem behavior on extinction, problem behavior will persist because presumably it has some response class shared control by problem behavior, and these old mands are being controlled by the same reinforcer. Because they've been historically reinforced in the same context, when you reinforce that pre-existing mand, you will get problem behavior despite not reinforcing it at the moment. They showed how, by contrast, when you shaped a new mand and you differentiate reinforce that new mand, they did not see persistence of the problem behavior. And I think they showed it in a reversal design. It's a pretty elegant study, but more information would be nice. But that's enough information for me to say, let's go with the new mand, and we might see the effect of differential reinforcement more readily than if we choose pre-existing mand for ease of acquisition.
Cool. All right. So Mina Benjamin asks, let's see. Did discrepancies in construct validity found across indirect, direct, and experimental FAs hold up for functional analyses of verbal behavior as well?
I'm going to be honest, Matt, with you. I don't know how to answer this question. There's a lot going on in there. Discrepancies in construct validity. I don't know exactly what they're referring to. There are some studies comparing indirect and descriptive and functional analyses, and I understand why those studies were conducted when they were, but for me, in this day and age, these are different things. It's not surprising that indirects and descriptives and analyses don't match up, because the world of controlling variables is too big, and they're complementary, not substitutable assessments. So I don't lose sleep over this construct validity issue in functional analysis. The only validity that matters to me is treatment utility. And we've shown that by combining interviews and analyses, we can affect meaningful behavior change.
And with your process, it's not like an either or, right? So you're using the interview to help guide the analysis process.
That's right. Yeah. So I don't see them as distinct. I see them as complementary. And so I don't know about the first part of the question. And as far as the implications for meeting verbal behavior deficits, there are really two gross paths, if you will, two big paths you can take. And one is taking kind of a verbal behavior approach. And there are curricula out there to develop language skills. And I prefer that kind of functional approach. And then the other approach is, well, starting with the EOs for problem behavior and teaching language that seem to be related to those EOs, those events that are evoking problem behavior. I obviously prefer that path, because the kids that are coming to us are people complaining about problem behavior. So we start on that path. And then to me, again, they're not substitutable, they're complementary. I think practitioners would be smart to start with problem behavior, because that's where the child is exceptionally motivated. You have a powerful reinforcer, and we're going to teach language from that establishing operation. And then once we have that going down in problem behavior to 0 levels, then I think taking on verbal behavior approach or other like curricula would be great. I am fairly certain I did not answer Mina's question, but I'm simply responding to some of those words that I understand, and those are the responses I have to it.
Okay. Let's go to Michelle Mazzolini. She asks, what's the deal with visual schedules being bad? And I'm tempted to do that in like a Seinfeld voice, but I don't want to nauseate the listeners, but it sounds like something Seinfeld. What's the deal?
Yeah.
So this is a question I've gotten quite a bit, as a matter of fact. And I get into little arguments with some of the people I consult with who, I think, I don't want to say ritualize the use of visual schedules, but use them regardless of whether they're beneficial or not. In other words, if you have autism, you need a visual schedule.
That's right. That's right.
So,
well, I agree with the sentiment that you're sharing. I visual schedules are neither good nor bad. Okay, but I would agree with the sentiment that we may overuse them. We may put a little too much confidence in their ability to do good.
Yeah.
Okay. And I think last, we as a field aren't appreciating the fact that not only can they sometimes be irrelevant, but they may be relevant to influencing problem behavior. In other words, they may lead to a worsening for the child, not necessarily some benefit. So I may have said this in some presentations based on a little bit of data. And we need a lot more data here. And I'm not saying these things to be provocative. I'm saying these things because I'm sitting on research that is going to take a while to get out in publication. But I will refer to one study. This is a study by Joshua Jessel. It was published last year in JABA. It's a translational evaluation of transitions.
Oh, yeah. I remember that one.
I refer to it for two reasons. One, he outlined some nice basic research and some applied research that shows the trouble with what might be best called signaled transitions, which is what we're essentially doing with visual or textual schedules, signaled transitions. The basic research is from Mike Perrone's group primarily, and what it shows is that when you have someone working in a relatively rich reinforcement context, and they're going to transition to another reinforcing context, but it's not as rich. Okay, so it's a leaner reinforcement context. There's nothing necessarily inherently aversive about this second context. It's simply not as good as the primary or the context they're in. When there's a signal that's an animal, a non-human animal, or a person is moving from the rich schedule to the relatively lean schedule, and again, that transition is signaled, that's a reliable way to produce pausing, meandering, escape behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So given that, let's think about what a visual schedule does. About 50% of the time, there's a rich to lean transition, and we're signaling to the child, hey kid, I know you love what you're doing now. I just want to let you know that it's going to get crappier.
Right.
Let's go. That's what's happening
And
50% of the
smile
time
while
in a
you're at
visual
it. Yeah.
schedule. That's right. Now, the other 50% of the time, what's happening? They're going from a relatively lean schedule, if you will, to something more rich. And you'll see some nice, beautiful transitions. So when we say the child's having problems transitioning, and I see that there's a visual schedule on the wall that is actually influencing the child, they are under control of the visual schedule. That might be a problem because we're signaling impending doom. We're signaling worsenings. Okay. The treatment for that is not terribly forthcoming, but there's a couple ideas. One, remove the signals. If you simply go to the next place and you don't tell the child in advance that it's going to get worse, you might get rid of any transition-related issues. What Josh recommended in his paper was I think we call them surprise boxes. But basically, we put question marks on the schedule. And so the child doesn't know whether they're going to an area that is better than where they are currently or worse than where they are currently. And when we have this intermittent, unpredictable improvement and worsening, we think we can eradicate some of these transition difficulties. So it's really a complicated topic. I am clearly not saying get rid of visual schedules. When a child with autism comes into a new program and they're anxious, I do believe it makes good sense to teach them basically where they're going to go, where they're going to be next, when the van's going to come, all those kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, once a child comes under control of those cues, that's exactly when we need to start working on dealing with going to a worse location and putting in some unpredictability into the schedule and teaching them to tolerate that. Ultimately, too, though, we need to teach kids to tolerate impending doom.
Right.
You know, when they overhear that they're going to the dentist tomorrow. Okay, so there's a lot of clinical opportunity here is what I'm getting at. And there's a developmental process, okay? But the bottom line is visual schedules are neither good nor bad. They're complicated. And I think we need to appreciate the nuance with these visual schedules.
Yeah, and again, I agree with that. And I also think that it's something that a lot of people that we consult to have kind of grown up literally in the field using and relying on and stuff like that. And so,
Sure.
yeah, it's sometimes, at least in my experience, really difficult for a special education teacher who's been using these systems for years and years and years to take the schedule down, you know.
Yes.
That's hard because they've seen it. And if you think of it from a reinforcement standpoint, they've seen it work, a high probability,
Well, that's
amount
the
of
funny
time.
thing, Matt, the working part. One of the doctoral students in our doc program here at Western New England, her name's Berglund Sveinsdottir. She did a wonderful review paper. And in that review paper, she looked at the efficacy of visual schedules for producing, behavior change. We don't have a lot of support for visual schedules being important for managing problem behavior, but that's usually what people are using them for. We have studies showing that can help people do their laundry better. We have studies showing it can help kids learn to use board games better, maybe interact well, knowing when to pick up the board game and when to put it away, things of that nature. But we don't have a lot of evidence showing that child has problem with transitions. The visual schedule is the independent variable that decreases that problem. But when I see them being used and I say, why do you have that schedule? It's for behavior management. And that's where I think we have the disconnect. Or at least that's what Berglund's literature review taught me.
Okay, cool. I'd love to check that out. All right. So Jessica Bear asks a very kind of broad question, but important. If you can go through the tolerance response procedure in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I'm not sure if this will be sufficient detail. What I want to preface this bit with is there's a study by Mashid Gayamagami. It came out in the very last issue of JABA, so the 2016 issue 4. I think it was released last week. And in that paper, it's titled Contingencies Promote Delay Tolerance. And in that paper, she painstakingly details these tolerance procedures across 4 different clients who present very differently. We have a toddler, we have an adult in a vocational facility, and we have a couple kids 6 to 9 years old from outpatient services. And so I really would encourage Jessica to look through that article. She does a really great job articulating the variance in the procedures that we use to teach tolerance responding. But essentially it goes like this. Once the child has a reliable MAND, it's occurring independently and to the exclusion of problem behavior, not an 80% reduction of problem behavior and not 80% independent. 0 problem behavior, 100% independent MAND under control of the EO. Then we start tolerance training. The very first step in the ratio depends on the probability of problem behavior. So let's say we have a child who has a very quick trigger. In other words, they take to problem behavior very quickly. The sessions will look like this. We will set the EO for the MAND. When they MAND, we will reinforce that probably 80% of the time. 4 out of 5 trials, let's say. 1 out of 5 trials, we will say no to the MAND. We will deny the MAND. We'll have somebody else or that person denying the MAND prompt the tolerance response. We make it developmentally simple. If the child does not have language, we're going to mold their hand into a thumbs up, or perhaps cross-lace their fingers and put them on the table as in a quiet hand response. If they have some vocal verbal behavior, we're going to teach them to say something quick. Okay, no problem. I'm cool. And we're going to prompt that. And as soon as they do that, we're going to provide the reinforcers that they MANDed for. We're only doing this 1 out of 5 trials. And so that's the beginning. If a child does not have a quick trigger to problem behavior, the EO takes time to percolate, we may go into a 50-50 probability. In other words, half the trials we reinforce the MAND immediately, the other half we prompt the tolerance response and reinforce the tolerance response. So we play that game for a while. Once the tolerance response is occurring independently and 0 problem behaviors are occurring and there's no emotional behavior, there's no tears, there's no whining, there's no discomfort whatsoever, then we might change the ratio a little bit. We deny more. We'll get it down to at worst or at best a third of the time we reinforce the MAND immediately, and the other trials we deny and we reinforce the tolerance response. Again, once that's happening, great. Then we ask for more than just the tolerance response. Now we're moving into the area we call compliance training. And so under compliance training, it's going to look like this. About a third of the time we reinforce the MAND. About a third of the time we reinforce that nice tolerance response. But a third of the time after they say, I'm okay, we ask them to do something that's contextually relevant, an academic thing, a transition thing, a play our way sort of thing. Once they do what we ask them to do, and what we ask them to do is very little at first, we reinforce that. And now we're at the very beginning of the final treatment, which is intermittent and unpredictable reinforcement of the life skills of communication, toleration, and compliance. The final step is to increase the amount you want them to do during that delay period till it gets to be something that's developmentally reasonable. So I'm sorry if Jessica wanted something more specific than that, but that's basically tolerance training in a nutshell. And again, I'd look at Mahshid's article for the details.
Okay, and I'll run down that reference. I've got I've got the issue right here in my hand.
Oh,
so
sweet.
Okay. I'll make sure to put that in the show notes. So
great.
Let me kind of piggyback a question on that.
Yeah.
So with regard to moving on into compliance, do you use any kind of behavioral momentum techniques in terms of, when you start compliance training? In other words, like starting something very, very easy to do and then escalating up to something that has historically evoked problem behavior, or do you go right to something challenging?
Yeah, that's a neat question. We do indeed start with something that's very easy for the child to comply with, developmentally inappropriate. In other words, it's below them developmentally.
Right,
we might have
touch your head,
language-able
whatever.
kids who could, they could code a computer and we're having them give us high fives.
Yep.
We do that.
Okay.
It is embarrassing slightly for a few sessions. But am I relying on behavioral momentum? Perhaps that's a theory, that's a concept. It might be helping us, but I'm not doing it for that reason. I'm doing it because I'd like the process to be fairly errorless. I'm
Hmm.
doing it to keep low rates of problem behavior. But we may be leveraging, if you will, this concept where if we build up a lot of reinforcement for compliance in that context, it'll persist despite the disruption in another context. So that may indeed be happening. But the bottom line procedurally is you are correct. We do start with very easy things for the child to comply with, and then we then escalate the number of things we ask them to do and the difficulty of the things we ask them to do until it emulates the stuff the parents want the child doing when they can't have their reinforcers. But yeah, we don't start there. And there perhaps is some benefit to starting there. Perhaps experiencing extinction early in the process would be healthy. It's just that for me, I'm trying to move into contexts that I've struggled with in the past, like public schools and group homes. And in those conditions, to me, it's very important to be somewhat errorless, to move this process and make it look like coaching when we're just working on skills and practice. And it doesn't look like escape extinction is at play.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Megan Miller from session 14 asks, after listening to the podcast and hearing the discussion you all had about the application of ISCA with other populations, and now having heard Mark Dixon say that they're showing undifferentiated functional analysis results with their participants who score higher on the peak assessment, I'm dying to know if Greg or others who have been working in the area of FAs for decades have experienced this. And she writes, more complex functions of behavior with higher performance on assessments, or for individuals who are so-called higher functioning. So let me just kind of, I guess, try to summarize what she's saying, or I'm guessing at least. So, higher cognitively functioning individuals, is it your kind of experience, whether it's documented in the literature or not, do they have more complex functional analysis or more broadly functional assessment results?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's nothing in the literature that would support the saying that the higher functioning, higher cognitive abilities, the more likely we're going to see a complex function or even multiple control. Okay, we don't have those data. But that said,
I was waiting for that.
Yeah, when we've done these ISCA replications, and Josh Jessel just published 30 ISCAs. I have another student at Atheon, Rajaraman. We have about 100 ISCAs that he's working on a paper to show the replications. There are some times where we do an interview and we do an analysis and we get what's closest to a single or simple or generic function. And those are almost always folks who are adults that are severely cognitively impaired and are in fairly tough resourced situations. Group homes without a lot of stuff, vocational sites without a lot of stuff. And we're seeing single functions like SIB maintained by food, for instance, is an example in Josh's paper. So that is, I see that, okay? And when it comes to kids who have language, so let's say if a kid has fluent some vocal verbal fluency, let's call that high functioning.
Sure.
Those kids clearly are more likely to have compliance with MANS as one of the controlling variables for their problem behavior. In other words, those kids are asking for things to be a particular way or to have things, and when those MANS are not reinforced, they have problem behavior. That is definitely a more complex relation than attention or stuff or merely escape. Okay, it's a little more dynamic. They manned, it's denied. The denial evokes the problem behavior. The parent or teacher then tries to turn off the problem behavior, providing that which was mandated for. That's more complicated than attention.
Mm-hmm.
So I believe Megan is correct, and maybe Dr. Dixon's article might be bearing this out, that kids with language have more dynamic controlling variables. I have no doubt. I also have not met a kid with good language that engages in problem behavior for single things: attention, stuff, or escape. But I also don't believe those functions exist purely in nature anyway. The more I'm thinking about it and writing about it, the more I'm learning that there is no pure test for attention. There is no pure test for attention escape, and there is no pure test for tangibles. People deliver tangibles. People escape to things. Attention often leads to some sort of interaction with materials in the environment. There's all sorts of interactions going on. So let me, I guess, end on this. I believe all kids' problem behavior is probably maintained by more complex functions than that which we've been seeing and describing to date. And back to Megan's point, is it likely that kids with language have more complex control of behavior? Certainly.
Yeah.
There's no doubt. It's just the literature is going to take time to catch up with that.
So to kind of piggyback on your answer there, I getting to the notion that, if I've heard you correctly in previous conversations, there is no, when you say something like there is no true function, does that kind of get to, I don't know if I said that entirely precisely, but does that kind of get to, what Jack Michael was writing about, a while back in terms of, the distinction between positive and negative reinforcement is somewhat, I don't know, correct me if I'm not saying this in the right way, but it's somewhat arbitrary. It's that we're all kind of fleeing some aversive state to something that's more reinforcing in general, and we just kind of characterize that as positive and negative reinforcement.
Listen, as scientists, as behavior analysts, we're cutting up the behavior environment interactions into tidy units so we can understand them. Okay, that's in a Skinnerian sense what we're doing. I get it. It's that's what science does, and that's good. But yes, I am parroting, if you will, that notion that Jack Michael gave us. And it's not that the positive and negative is arbitrary per se. It's just that they're not discrete. They're continuous variables. Okay, these things of positive and negative reinforcement, we might imagine them more as these continuous variables that have more overlap than not. And I do find the language game regarding positive and negative reinforcement to have been exceptionally useful in the history of understanding the variables controlling problem behavior, but I see it now as an obstacle that we need to get over. If you only look for is it positive, is it negative, you're going to miss these qualitatively rich controlling contingencies like compliance with MANs. That has a whole bunch of positive and negative reinforcement rolled into it, and you're not going to see it if you're going to try to put it in those tidy boxes. So I do think historically useful constructs, positive and negative reinforcement. I think they're still useful, but I think we need to recognize that they're very hard to isolate, that they don't occur in nature in isolation, and that our attempts to be maybe hyper analytic are probably thwarting our efforts to be effective as interventionists. These things are powerful together. I've mentioned this in previous episodes, but it bears repeating. Escape to stuff is more powerful. We have evidence of that. There's a study by Jen Zarconi in JABA. It's escape to nothing or escape to, play, and clearly escape to play was more powerful. I think I have that right. Kathleen Piazza's, I believe, an author on that. But there's other articles in the literature. Mike Mueller has some studies. Nate Call has some studies. We have studies showing that when you combine positive and negative reinforcement, you show problem behavior sensitivity, and when you try to isolate them, you don't. So again, I'm really glad we tried to isolate these things going historically, because that's taught us to look for them now. But I think we need to be less reductionistic and more holistic as we look at contingencies going forward. And it's not holistic in that negative, like, I don't know, non-scientific way to approach a problem. It's just trying to understand the coherency in the whole of our contingencies. And I think we're at a mature point in our field where we can do that now. Thank goodness for the hyper-analytic stuff that has been done in the past, but I think we can do it now.
Okay. So Edward Pollard, he wrote in with a pretty long question. I'm going to try to summarize it here. He works in public school settings, in general education classrooms, and there's some students that he's working with. His general question is about using this process with kiddos with emotional behavioral disorders, kids who perhaps are from a cognitive standpoint are within kind of typical ranges, if you will,
Yeah.
or as I think you mentioned in a previous interview, sometimes even have superior IQs and things like that.
There you go.
And but nonetheless have challenging behavior. So some of the kiddos he works with have problem behaviors that include profane language, bolting, climbing fences, hitting and spitting. Spitting's always one that gets people worked up, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a toughie.
It's there's so many people I work with that are like, I'd rather get hit than spit at,
That's right. That's right.
Just proper destruction, etc. So let's see. I'm trying to get to the nut of his question here. So he's been trying to figure out a way to apply the ISCA to this population, and he's found a couple of barriers. One is he says it's not always possible to turn off the behavior by reinforcing it. In other words, once kids are escalated, they don't easily de-escalate. And so once that kind of furnace is stoked, that fire takes a long time to put out. I'm kind of paraphrasing here, and I've seen this certainly in my own work. Even when they're provided with any and all the reinforcers that they hypothesize are at play here. And then the follow-up question to that is that he can't always control the reinforcing consequence. In other words, sometimes it may be peers, and I'm sure anyone who's worked in regular ed settings certainly have seen, that's a very, very near impossible variable to control, when peers react to challenging behaviors and things like that, and so forth. So, having said that, what are your thoughts on applying the ISCA process to an EBD population in regular ed settings under circumstances where the reinforcers are very difficult to control and problem behaviors evoke escalation that takes a long time to kind of de-escalate?
Sure. Let's take the latter first. That whole notion of once they escalate, hard to de-escalate, and people worry doing an analysis because if they're evoking the behavior, they may not be able to turn it off. I think that's an excellent concern. We should all have that concern before we do an analysis, especially in public school, especially with kids who have a really dangerous behavior. They can hurt themselves, hurt others. So that said, to me, it's all in the methodological details. So let's go over the reasons why behavior doesn't de-escalate. Number one, it's sometimes because we're not providing all the reinforcers. So that is the first thing I want this person to consider, is that let's make sure we do a good interview and we're providing all the possible reinforcers. That's my main issue with isolating reinforcers. It's not that sometimes when they're isolated, we don't see sensitivity. That's a problem too. The bigger problem is that we have multiple EOs operating and we provide a single reinforcer, we're not able to turn off that problem behavior. And so that really takes us back to an importance of an interview, importance of having multiple reinforcers that may be controlling problem behavior at hand in the test condition of analysis. But that's not the real solution. That can be helpful though. The better solution is this. In the interview, we need to ask about all of the co-occurring topographies of problem behavior so we can reinforce early members of the response chain. When I used to do analyses, if the people complained about yelling, hitting, tisking, knocking things off the table, as well as severe self-injury and aggression, in my analysis, I waited till we saw severe aggression or self-injury perhaps until we reinforced. Under those conditions, it is possible that the reinforcer may not escalate behavior, but that's usually the case when there's some emotional responding, and emotional responding often is correlated with these more intense forms of aggression or self-injury. So that said, what's the solution? The solution is interviewing, identifying precursors or co-occurring behaviors, or another way to say it is early members of the response chain, and in the analysis to reinforce those members. And people are worried about that. People don't like that inferential leap, right? They figured out why the kids pushing materials off the desk. They showed sensitivity to the contingency, but they never saw aggression. So in the back of their mind, they're always saying, yeah, but is the same reinforcement contingency controlling that severe behavior as that which I showed controlling the precursor behavior? I think we have enough studies showing that when people report these things co-occurring in time and in context, that they're probably maintained by the same reinforcer. There's a study by Christine Warner. She's presented it at Babbitt. She'll be presented. It's presented at APBA and again at ABAI. And basically, it shows that when we've done extinction analyses, in other words, we keep running the ISCA out and putting milder topographies of problem behavior on extinction. As we do that, we see the more severe topographies emerge, and we see control by that same contingency. So let me make something clear. When people report these problem behavior forms co-occur, they're probably maintained by the same reinforcer.
Mm-hmm.
Be comfortable with the inferential leap that if you reinforce some kind of low intensity behavior, that's probably the same as the controlling variable as the high intensity behavior. And the final thing is the truth will be borne out by the kid's response to treatment. So if you base your treatment on what you learned from the easy to watch behavior, then and all the problem behavior is remedied with the treatment, the deal is done. We call that response to intervention. That's a healthy way to approach this situation. So let me summarize for this issue of de-escalation. 1, provide all the possible reinforcers. 2, provide them for all topographies of problem behavior in the ISCA. It sounds sloppy, but it's the way to maintain safety and probably efficacy with this process.
Cool. Well stated. All right. So Jennifer Lamarca asks, question for Dr. Hanley. Sometimes I struggle to figure out the function of a child's behavior, especially if it could be a multiple function. What resources should I go to improve my analysis?
Jennifer, thanks for setting up this question. Here's what I want you to do.
Practicalfunctionalassessment.com.
That's right. I want you to go to our website called practicalfunctionalassessment.com and take a look at some of the materials. I mean, basically, Jennifer, I believe that most behavior is under multiple control. I think that's been a big mistake in the history of our understanding controlling variables for problem behavior. I initially was taught and learned that multiple control is a fleeting, low incident kind of phenomena. I just don't think that's the case anymore. Now, partly it's because we're dealing with a wider array of people and controlling contingencies than we did in the past. Okay, but I think it's also because we're seeing multiple control more now because we're looking for it, because we're designing analyses that are able to detect it. So what resources? I really would just do I assume multiple control, and I just do an ISCA. And I synthesize those contingencies in a single test control analysis. If I am able to control behavior effectively, i.e. see 0 in control and a short latency to problem behavior in the test, I know I got a properly motivated kid to learn my skills, the skills I want to teach him, and I know that I can turn off behavior, and I know I can be safe. And so I proceed. So go to that website, check it out. I hope it's useful.
Yeah, and I would add, Jennifer, I would recommend on Greg's website, and again, I'll just reiterate, it's practicalfunctionalassessment.com. There's a YouTube video that is particularly helpful of Greg doing a training, and that's probably one of the many resources on that site that you could check out. And Greg also talks about this in sessions 1 and 2. And we do some follow-up questions about this process in session 7 of the podcast as well. So you can go to behavioralobservations.com and look for sessions 1 and 7. But practicalfunctionalassessment.com is going to be your go-to for all things ISCA. So thanks for writing in, Jennifer. All right, so I've got a question from Laura Honeycutt, and she looks like she's a master's student. She's trying to figure out what to do for a project. So let's see. She's curious if Dr. Hanley has any thoughts on alternative types of assessments, and I'm not exactly sure what she's asking about in specific here, but she's planning on conducting a study for her thesis where she's manipulating antecedents. So it's some sort of antecedent control study, but she's not attempting to control whether or not the target behavior is reinforced or not. And to conduct the study in a natural environment. She doesn't specify what environment that is. Let's see. I will interview relevant adults and attempt to set up my experimental control conditions to ensure. Any suggestions on ways to improve my design or its reliability?
You know what? I'm really glad Laura shared this. And here's the deal. I hope Laura is listening. And I'm going to give some advice. She asked for advice, so I'm going to give it. And my advice is don't do what you're planning to do. And that sounds a little harsh, and it lacks some tentativeness that perhaps an advisor should have. But here goes. identifying various antecedents that are controlling problem behavior is a good quest, but you articulated that you're not going to attempt to control whether or not the target behavior is reinforced. And to me, that is dangerous. And we already know the answer to this question. Historically, in the 80s, there was an A-B model of analysis. It was where there was the establishing operation manipulated, but there was no direct manipulation of consequences. It was not described what happened following problem behavior. It was left to vary naturally. The problem with that is twofold. Number one, scientifically, if you allow the consequences to vary naturally, we do not know what's controlling behavior if you don't describe them and program them. Okay, so scientifically it's challenging. But practically, it's tough because if you set up provocative conditions, antecedent conditions that will actually evoke problem behavior, and you do not reinforce them, I want you to think about what's going to happen. If you don't reinforce the problem behavior, it's going to persist. And in fact, it's going to induce variability and might get worse. And that's where analyses become unsafe. We don't need that alternative assessment. If we're going to not be marginalized as professionals and invited into schools and homes and hospitals, we need to ensure safety of our clients. And oddly enough, safety is almost ensured by providing the correct reinforcers. It's a funny thing in the history of the field, and this is complicated, Laura, so please don't take my words the wrong way. This is something we've been dealing with as a field for a long time. Ted Carr is one of my heroes, okay? But Ted Carr wrote in several articles in the late 70s as he was kind of describing the possible variables that might control self-injurious behavior and teaching us about how attention might control behavior and escape might control behavior. Really powerful articles. In the context of those articles, he wrote that he thought it would be unethical to provide those supposed reinforcers for problem behavior in an analysis. To Ted Carr, it seemed unethical to provide reinforcers for problem behavior. It seemed really counterintuitive to reinforce problem behavior like it does to many people. But that was 40 years ago. And what we've learned in those 40 years is that reinforcing the problem behavior turns it off. Reinforcing the problem behavior is humane. Reinforcing the problem behavior is what leads to safety. Not reinforcing the problem behavior is probably going to get you into hot water. I don't think we need that alternative assessment. We've had it, okay, and we've decided not to use it any longer as a field, by and large. Okay. Let's take you back to your thesis. How about this?
Okay, good. I was gonna go there.
That was too negative. Let's get positive. How about manipulate those antecedents? Because that's really what you're excited about. I think there's probably various antecedents, and they're qualitatively rich for the clients that you're seeing, and you want to discover whether those qualitatively rich antecedents are differentially controlling their behavior. Great, do that. But in your methods, provide the reinforcers in that antecedent analysis, but just provide the same synthesized reinforcer across all the different antecedent conditions. You still have a nice controlled analysis. If you see differences across the conditions, it's clearly the different antecedent, but you're going to do it in a safe context because you're providing those putative reinforcers. So I think it's a cool project, and I hope you're listening to this. Good luck with it.
All right. Hey, Greg, thanks for giving her some pointing her in the right direction with some alternatives for that, because I know students, a large percent of the audience are students and things like that. So that's not only going to be helpful for Laura, but for many, many listeners to the show. So let's see. All right. The following question, this individual deserves an award for homework because she really went to town here. Maitri Sivaraman, and I profoundly apologize. As someone who has a last name that's difficult to pronounce, I feel your pain. So if I've butchered your name, I sincerely apologize. But Maitri asks, and she's writing in from India. Hi, Matt. I absolutely enjoyed the podcast on your website. Said some nice things. Thank you, Maitri. It's my pleasure. I'm a BCBA in Chennai, India, and I've implemented the ISCA approach with 2 of my young learners. Awesome. I have a couple of questions for Dr. Hanley's upcoming Q&A session. Number 1. Are there any generalization data? In other words, has tolerance and compliance training in a few chosen provocative situations resulted in improvements in other provocative situations? For example, if escape to play at home with mom is a synthesized contingency where training occurred, what about similar provocative situations at school or in a store, etc.?
Yeah, super question. All these questions are great.
Yeah,
This is
she
a smart,
definitely,
smart person.
yeah.
Yeah, you can tell she's right in the thick of it, doing great work. Th- this is complicated a bit. I'll try to be quick with it. Generalization can be somewhat assumed from the original article in the sense that we did indeed teach the skills in a particular context, an outpatient clinic, extended them to parents, and then in sessions outside the room, and then in the home. Uh, and then we socially validated the outcomes where parents said, listen, the child's doing well in all these other contexts that we didn't directly teach in. So we can assume some generalization from those data. That said, now that we're actually studying the generalization process, in other words, we're treating in context A with person A and evaluating whether that transitions to context B and person C without any direct teaching, what we're finding is a failure to generalize more often than not. So I want to make that very clear. We are not seeing these skills readily transition to new context unless we have the child experience the treatment in that new context with that additional person. Now, we are seeing some generalization. When I'm saying those, we're seeing incomplete generalization. A couple things you might want to look at. There's a neat study by Kevin Lozinski. It's basically on the preschool life skills, which are essentially the same things we're talking about here, communication and toleration. And he showed that there was some generalization, but complete generalization, in other words, absence of problem behavior, independent skills, required them experiencing the treatment in that setting, which is not generalization, right? It's just multiple exemplar training. So my short end of answer then is this. We cannot hope for generality here. We have to program it, just like Stokes and Baer taught us. If there's a challenging context in which you did not extend the treatment to, I suggest you have the child experience the treatment in that context. And then through multiple exemplar training, we are seeing extension to contexts in which we never did any direct training. Tanya Mouzakas is doing that study. She's presented those data at our local Babbitt conference. She should be presenting similar data, I believe, at ABBA. So we're working on it. But my safe and conservative recommendation is to make sure you do training in multiple challenging situations for this treatment to have impact on a 24/7 long-term basis.
Okay. Now, would you say skill acquisition is faster once you start training in other exemplars?
Yeah, Matt, that's a great question. Actually, Tanya's data bears that out completely. Every time we implement the treatment in a new context, we see the number of sessions it takes to get elimination of problem behavior and skills all independent to be fewer and fewer, sometimes to the point where it happens all in the first 5 minutes.
Okay.
And so
I know what the rules are here.
Yeah, exactly. It's a learn-to-learn phenomenon. People used to call it learning sets. I'm not sure the appropriate term, but you are spot on that we see the treatment have the desired impact quicker and quicker each time we extend it.
All right, cool. All right, so my second question here. During compliance training, Hanley's 2014 study had instructions classified into 3 levels of increasing complexity. How were these instructions determined, and how was complexity measured? What role did the interview play in this? Wow, that's an awesome question.
It really is. Great detail-oriented question. We did use 3 levels of complexity. They're not arbitrary, but there's no great measurement of complexity. I want to be clear on that. It's more like what I call backward design. What we're moving backwards from are the parents' goals. We ask them in the interview, and you're right, the interview is relevant here. We ask them in the interview, when they can't have these things that are apparently reinforcing their problem behavior, what do you want them to do? Okay, what is appropriate? What are your expectations for them? So if it's a child that has problem behavior when they're the young child, when their mom leaves them and takes their toys away, obviously the parent's going to want them to learn to play with other stuff without the mom. Okay, so that's our goal. Another child, they may have a problem when they have to lose their stimmy toys and do discrete trials. So what are we going to want them to do? What's the goal? live without your STEMI toys, and be accurate with your discrete trials.
Mm-hmm.
And so we get those goals from the parents, and we backward design those 3 levels from those goals. So the top level are those goals. The second level is an approximation of the goal. So if we want the child to do a bunch of discrete trials, we're going to have them do a few discrete trials, okay? And the first level is just simple, usually imitation stuff that we know the child can do just so we can get some compliance off the ground without problem behavior. So the 3 levels of complexity, again, the last level are the parents' goals, the amount and type of things they want the child to do. The second level is an approximation of that. And the first level is just simple stuff to get compliance off the ground.
Awesome. Any particular reason to prefer the contingency-based delay over the more traditional time-based delay?
Again, this is a great practitioner. If she's interested in applying to graduate school, she might look at the West New England University program, because I love these questions. Basically, the quick answer to this is look at the latest issue of JABA for that study I mentioned earlier by Mashid Gayamagami. Her entire dissertation was comparing contingency-based delay to time-based delay. And in each and every application, progressive or the contingency-based delay conferred advantage over time-based delay. Let me give you the long story in a nutshell. When you use time-based delay, when the delay ends according to time and you provide the reinforcer, what we're doing is accidentally reinforcing whatever's happening at that moment in time.
Mm-hmm.
By contrast with contingency-based delay, we're reinforcing something specific. Okay, we're not ending the delay until they've done precisely what we expected them or asked them to do. And by so doing, we're shaping up a really nice repertoire of things to do during delay rather than accidentally reinforcing things. So that's really where we find the advantage of contingency-based delay. And for us, it's a definite. The only advantage of time-based delay is you don't have to have any vigilance, okay? And so we worry a little bit about how much you need to watch kids during delays, during contingency-based delay, and we're working on that. Just to give you a foreshadow, we do what might be best called a momentary DRA, which looks like this. Parents check in on the child during the delay, and if they're doing what's expected, then we reinforce then. So we don't have to have vigilance during that whole delay period. But that might be beyond this question. The main point is look at Mashid's 2016 article, and really articulates why we prefer contingency over time-based delay.
So I actually, so is that the, that's with you and Joshua Jessel, right? And that's contingencies promote delay tolerance.
That's exactly right.
Okay. All right. So I've got the exact citation here. That'll be in the show notes, since we've referenced that a couple of times here. So, awesome. Let's see. Based on Hanley's 2016 study, where there are 7 participants who needed secondary or tertiary interventions, are there any suggestions to prevent this from happening? What was missed in the first iteration for these participants?
Another great question. Just to clarify, this study that she is referring to was published. First author is Joshua Jessel. It's Jessel, Hanley, and Gayamagami. It's also in the last issue of JABA, and it's the 30 replications of the ISCA. In that paper, we made it very clear that in those 30 differentiated analyses, some were not differentiated on the first attempt. And I want to make it clear that historically, when functional analyses have been published, that which we're seeing in the journal is not necessarily the first attempt. So we are encouraging authors to describe the number of iterations of the analysis before they arrived at the one that was differentiated. And Josh has taken the lead by making it clear in this article.
It's very transparent.
Yeah, I think it's important for us to try to get there without littering the literature with a bunch of undifferentiated analyses. So we got to find that balance. Perhaps a sentence in the text is sufficient. But nevertheless, what I'm finding is that this iterative process is happening at least 20 to 25% of the time we do ISCAs. So let me be clear on that. 3 out of 4 times, 4 to 5 times, the ISCAs yield a differentiated analysis the first time. But 20 to 25% of the time, we have to try again. And I don't know how to prevent this yet. But what we are learning and collecting information on is the changes we're making to get a differentiated analysis. We're working on a paper right now. Robin Landa will be presenting data at the APBA conference titled something like Progressing from an Undifferentiated to a Differentiated ISCA. And she's outlining all the things we do when we initially fail. I'll give you what I think is probably the main one leads to a change. Very often the interview suggests it's escape to tangibles and attention. When we ask the questions and then try to emulate that story in the analysis, when we give instructions, we're often given instructions at too fast a pace, and we're giving too much attention to the child while we're giving them instructions that's not similar to how they get instructions in their classroom or in their home. In the home and the classroom, it's more like do this worksheet and the aide talks to somebody else or maybe engages another child, or the parent says, brush your teeth, and then walks away. When we emulate this in the analysis, we're often talking to the kid too much while we're instructing. And I think what we're doing is we're abolishing the value of attention and thereby not evoking problem behavior. So a lot of times in this second iteration, when the contingency is a traditional escape to stuff and attention, what we're pulling out is how much and how fast we're prompting a child to do what we asked them to do. And when we make that change, we're often seeing that change result in the evocation of problem behavior. So that's just one example. I wish I could give you more detail, but this is something we're figuring out. But the main point, and I'm really happy this question was raised because I can make this main point. The main point is functional analysis is to be understood as an iterative process. You interview, you analyze. If you get good control over behavior, you treat. And if you don't, you continue to analyze and you make changes till you get good control of behavior. That's the point. We are behavior analysts. The point is to keep up your analysis till you control behavior and making slight modifications based on what the parents and teachers tell you. Again, I made this clear in previous podcasts. We always have the relevant people watch our analysis. And if the analysis isn't differentiated, I simply go outside and ask them, what are we doing wrong? And they usually tell us. And we make that change. And that's why it's hard to put in an article and to categorize these things, because the parents are just seeing that we're behaving in a somewhat ecologically invalid way. And then they teach us how to behave like them. And when we do that, we see differentiation. And we will describe it scientifically. It's just taken us some time to do that.
So it's why they call it a practice, right?
That's right. Yeah, there you go. There you go.
Cool. Well, my three, man, thank you so much. That was, a really, she gets the homework award for sure for questions. I have I have both of those studies. Those will go in the show notes. So last question here. Gabrielle asks, I've been using Greg's functional assessment to help determine functions of behaviors, and I do like it. All right. So far, so good, right?
That's right. Oh, we'll take it.
I was wondering about behavior plan formats. Specifically, New York State outlines components of behavior plans to ensure that they have necessary items, but I was wondering more about how he or other BCBAs write the mastery criteria section. My colleagues and I find this awkward to detail unless there is a clear IEP goal. Otherwise, would it be percentage decrease from baseline? Or in cases of aggression, SIB, et cetera, would it be 0 occurrences over a period of time? One of the things. Anyway, so I've got some thoughts on this, but let me hear what you have to say.
Matt, you could probably answer this question better than I can, but I'll give it a first stab, and then please follow up and help me and Gabrielle. But basically, it is important to write objectives, and sometimes those are lacking in IEP goals. But let me make it clear, if we get to the point we're involved in this behavior plan process, our goal is for problem behavior to be 0. So I just want to make that clear. The goal is 0, and for precursors too. And we can get 0 because we're teaching replacement skills, okay? The goal is 0, but then we have to have a criteria. In X many contexts, we describe the context for X many observations. So that's where it becomes an objective. All objectives have to have a criteria where the child passes, succeeds, or fails so that we can adjust or we can pass them on it. And so for us, all off this process, all the BIPs have a problem behavior objective. That objective specifies the learner, 0 level. It specifies the number of contexts. The contexts are the provocative context parents described in the interview, and it describes how many observations we need to see 0 consecutively. So that's the first one. Secondarily, we always have skill-based objectives. So the objective cannot just be on problem behavior.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to have objectives on communication, toleration. Those objectives are going to be more trial-based. So we're going to say when given the establishing operation and given an opportunity to communicate, we're looking for the probability they will independently communicate. We are not looking for 100% of trials. We love it if we present a very difficult instruction and the child does not ask for their way, that they simply persist and do it. But we are asking for a percentage of time that they will engage in the communication response independently. We also have an objective related to when they're denied, that they will engage in a percentage of time in the tolerance response. And again, we specify in X many contexts, describe those contexts, and how many observations before we pass them on that goal. And then finally, we have a compliance goal. Compliance is never 100%. We're not looking for that, but we're looking for something above baseline that is reasonable for the teachers. And it's the same kind of criteria. Specify the context, specify how many observations before they're passed. You might be looking for something more, and I'm sorry if I'm missing your point, Gabrielle, but that's basically what we write in our BIPs.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and that's what I was going to suggest too, is, writing. What I like about this process, and I don't want to sound like, fanboy here, but, is that there are very tangible things to measure in terms of skill development, and so you could certainly program around functional communication, toleration, and compliance. So yeah, cool. Well, I think that's going to do it for our questions here. So thanks for taking the time to this morning. I'm looking out my window here, and the snow is starting to come down, so it's probably time for me to see if my snowblower starts.
Yes, exactly.
And Greg, where can we see you coming up? I know you're on the road quite a bit.
Yeah, I've been traveling a bit less. I'm doing much more journal work now, and I'm trying to allocate much more time to that, which is fun. But let's see. I'm going to be in Chicago. And I'm going to be in Chicago in a couple weeks, and on the website I'm going to post those dates today, as well as the materials for that conference. And then my students and I are going to go to APBA, and my students have some really nice data to present. I'll also be doing a workshop, and that is happening in March. And so I guess those are the two coming up. And I also want to mention that I because there's been other questions about why we do what we do. And I just wanted to make it clear, I guess, our defense of this ISCA.
Sure.
And so I made a set of narrated slides, and I'm also going to post that on the Practical Functional Assessment website. And I'm really doing it for practitioners who have chosen to do this the way we've described it, and they need to be able to defend it sometimes. And I want to help them be able to defend it, because I think it's highly defensible. But it is different, and so anyways, these narrated slides might be helpful to folks.
Great. If you send me the link to that, I'll make sure that goes in the show notes for this episode
sweet.
As well, and so we can get it out to as many listeners and viewers as possible. So
great.
Great. Greg, thanks again for taking the time to do this. I know my listeners greatly appreciate it. They get a chance to get their questions answered directly from the source, which is pretty cool. So again, appreciate you coming on the podcast for round number 3. So thanks for keeping us informed about all things ISCA. So
thanks, Matt. Again, I appreciate what you're doing. What you're doing is a great service. I love the podcast. So keep it up, and good luck with the blizzard we're about to get. And I look forward to talking to you again.
All right, right on. All right, bye-bye.
All right, man. Bye-bye.
Well, that went a little longer than expected. I think we're clocking out at well over an hour and a half, which is about 35 minutes longer than most of the episodes that I've done thus far. But in my humble opinion, lots of good content there because you guys provide the content. You guys sent in all these awesome questions, so we wanted to take time going through them to make sure that we answered them to the best of our ability. So again, this was a really fun episode. It made my interview prep quite easy, as a matter of fact. But that's not the only reason I liked it. I liked it because it was a chance for you guys to have some more interaction and to add to the community aspect of the show, which is something I really like. So show notes, head on over to behavioralobservations.com, look for session 20, and I will have that link to the narrated PowerPoint that Greg was talking about. You can also check it out at practicalfunctionalassessment.com. And let's see, what else? Oh, and I'll have links to those articles that Greg mentioned as well. So you can check those out, again, at behavioralobservations.com, session 20. And I think we'll have all that stuff there. I think that's pretty much it for now. I think I'm going to cap this episode before we get to an hour and 40 minutes. So thanks for taking the time to tune in. I will leave that listener survey up. You can check out my Facebook page, facebook.com/behavioral observations. The survey will still be there. I'll leave it live. So if you didn't get a chance to fill it out, you can head on over there and share your thoughts on the show. So until session 21 rolls around, I will see you guys later.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.